This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another deck history video. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes in competitive Magic from the moment they emerged all the way up to the modern day. As usual, I ran a poll last week to let the viewers decide the topic of this video, and it was a pretty close one. At least, it was close between Death Shadow and Caw-Blade, so close that at least at the time I was making this video, it's a virtual tie between the two of them. It may have actually changed by the time this video goes up, but I had to start making this video at some point. Since it's basically a tie, I decided I'll cast the tie-breaking vote, and I'm going to do it for Death Shadow. Caw-Blade will stick around in the poll next week, but it will have a tough opponent, so we'll see whether it can win another poll. If you really want to see Caw-Blade next week, go vote on the poll that's on the community tab now. Anyway, Death Shadow gets its name from Death Shadow. This 1-mana creature is a 13/13, but it gets -X/-X, where X is your life total, so in other words, you have to have 12 or less life or it just dies when it enters the battlefield. That means the Death Shadow can be crazy efficient, but playing it early isn't exactly easy in your typical Magic deck. Going super low on life is a pretty big setup cost, so big that Death Shadow took a very long time to ever find its way into competitive Magic, but obviously, since I'm making this video, it eventually got there, and it did it in a big way. Despite only emerging as a Tier 1 deck about 5 years ago in 2016, Death Shadow has seen a whole lot of variance over the years, from more controlling decks to all-out aggro decks. But the thing all of these decks have in common is that they use a bunch of cards that let them pay life so they can quickly get a massive Death Shadow into play. At one time or another, Death Shadow decks have found success in both Modern and Legacy, and in this video we'll take a look at when these decks emerged and how they changed over time. We'll begin with a look at Modern, since that's the first place where Death Shadow decks started to put up top 8s at premier events. As I noted earlier, Death Shadow decks took a while to emerge. In fact, it took so long that back in January 2019 when I did an MTG top 10 on bad cards that suddenly became good, Death Shadow came in at number 8. And that means there are only 7 other cards in all of Magic history that took longer to put up a premier event top 8. And to be exact, it took Death Shadow 2,298 days between when it was printed in Worldwake and its first premier event top 8 in 2016. Let's take a look at that Modern deck that finally allowed Death Shadow to break away from junk rare status. Sam Black was the first player to top 8 with a Death Shadow deck, and he did it at Grand Prix Charlotte in 2016. Sam's version of the deck was called Death Shadow Zoo, and it built upon the model of long successful zoo deck. These were typically Naya aggro decks that got their name because, back in the day, the deck was usually filled with the kinds of animals you'd see at the zoo. Sam added black to the deck for Death Shadow. So, how did he go about actually making Death Shadow a super powerful creature? Well, the first place to look is the mana base, which is made up entirely of shock lands and fetch lands. That means that on most turns you can go down 3 life just with the help of your land drops. It also ran Street Wraith, a cycler that pays 2 life to cycle, and Thoughtseize, a powerful discard spell that many modern black decks run anyway, but in this deck, losing that life is upside. In addition to that, the deck also ran Phyrexian mana cards like Gitaxian Probe and Mutagenic Growth. You can pay 2 life for these rather than pay any mana, and what's more is, the Probe and Mutagenic Growth also fit perfectly with the overall strategy of the deck and not just because of the Phyrexian mana. The deck could operate like any aggro deck could. It could simply play out its powerful 1-drops and turn them sideways until the opponent was dead. However, what sets Death Shadow decks apart from other aggro decks is that it had some serious combo potential that can take out your opponent's remaining life out of nowhere using various combat tricks, and the Probe and Mutagenic Growth were important for that. The Probe, Thoughtseize, and Mishra's Bauble could allow you to check that the coast is clear since you didn't want your opponent responding to you targeting your creature with tricks, and obviously Mutagenic Growth itself is a trick, so it multiplies the damage a lot. In fact, if you pay 2 life for it, you're probably giving your Death Shadow +4/+4. Key to this combo was Temur Battle Rage, which could quite easily turn Death Shadow lethal even all on its own. The deck also used Become Immense as a key combat trick. Because the deck threw fetch lands and free and cheap spells into the graveyard quickly, Become Immense could result in some pretty massive growth for only 1 or 2 mana, and when you're casting both of those spells, Temur, Battle Rage, and Become Immense, it doesn't even have to always be Death Shadow you're pumping. And that's one of the great things about this build of Death Shadow. It does bear the card's name, and it's a deck that is optimized to abuse it, but it's not entirely reliant on the Shadow to win games. Plus, the deck was actually incredibly consistent. It ran 12 copies of cards that cost 0 mana to draw a card between the Bauble, Street Wraith, and Gitaxian Probe, and that made the deck have the consistency of a 48 card deck instead of a 60 card one. Decks much like Sam's found more success throughout 2016, but the deck experienced some significant changes in 2017. This was partly the result of the banning of Gitaxian Probe in January of that year, a move that was meant to weaken Death Shadow and some other decks that were making use of the card at the time. With no probes, some players shifted away from the more aggressive plan that looked to combo with Battle Rage and other tricks because it couldn't get a look at the opponent's hand very consistently, and the deck itself was also made less consistent. Sam Black would put up another top 8 with the Death Shadow deck in 2017 though. This new variant is called Traverse Shadow, and 2 other players piloted it to top 8 finishes at the same event. As you can see, this deck is markedly different from the deck Sam piloted in 2016. The deck still has Death Shadow, of course, as well as several cards that cost life, pretty much the same ones that we saw in the 2016 deck. However, where this deck is different is that it is much less aggressive, and was much more of a graveyard deck. The Traverse in the deck's name comes from Traverse the Ulvenwald, a relatively new card at the time. Traverse was a powerful tutor if you could set up Delirium. It could even find you your Death Shadow. The deck cut way back on creatures, with Tarmogoyf really the only other creature in the deck that could represent a very real threat that you could combo with your Battle Rage. Obviously, the deck had to become a lot more controlling, and it did that by running some more interactive cards like Kolaghan's Command and Tarfire. Tarfire came with the added bonus of the Tribal card type, which enhanced Tarmogoyf as well as Traverse the Ulvenwald. The deck also ran an additional discard spell in Inquisition of Kozilek, which meant the deck still had lots of ways to look at the opponent's hand and take things away that might be a problem. While this more control-y Traverse the Ulvenwald variant was the first to emerge in the wake of the Gitaxian Probe ban, this was a time when there were a lot of different takes on Death Shadow that were top-8ing Premier events. For example, there were 2 Grand Prix that ended on May 28, 2017, Kobe and Copenhagen, and 3 Death Shadow decks managed top 8s between the 2 events, and there were 2 very different approaches taken among these decks, and none of them were the Traverse variant. First, let's take a look at the deck piloted by Park by O. Of the 3 decks that top-8ed during the weekend, his was perhaps the greatest departure from what came before, because it was a completely different color combination. It was Grixis. The deck went a little deeper on the graveyard and control themes, but obviously it didn't do it for Traverse the Ulvenwald. Instead, it did it for powerful delve creatures, Gurmag Angler and Tasigur the Golden Fang, which gave the deck additional very cheap threats. One other really notable thing is that this deck doesn't run Temur Battle Rage at all. The deck simply sought to load the graveyard, get value out of it, and attack with large efficient creatures as early as possible. One really sweet card for the deck was Stubborn Denial, which was often a very powerful counterspell because the deck ran so many large creatures. It would go on to be a fixture in modern Death Shadow decks. During that same weekend, Gunnar Geisler top-8ed Grand Prix Copenhagen with a deck that went back to the Zoo build. It returned to a very creature-heavy deck, playing 1-drops like Wild Nacatl and Monastery Swiftspear, and it didn't bother with slower cards like Traverse the Ulvenwald or Tasigur. But it also had a couple of other notable inclusions that we haven't seen yet. One of them was Grim Flayer, which gave the deck a good 2-drop that could load up the graveyard, while also acting as another large creature once you got Delirium going, and Gore Clan Rampager, which could sort of act as more flexible additional copies of Temur Battle Rage thanks to its Blood Rush ability. You'll note also that this deck is full-on 4 colors. It did this partly to gain access to Renegade Rallier. While we saw the card in an earlier version of the deck, it was a much bigger part of this deck since it's so creature-heavy. If you could Revolt, which was quite easy with fetch lands, it could just bring back a slain Death Shadow or other cheap creature, which is quite powerful. The deck also played lands of all 5 types, which meant it could easily run Tribal Flames, which could do 4 damage pretty consistently, and 5 damage more often than you'd think. This provided some additional reach in a deck that has a whole lot of ways to damage opponents, in addition to being able to take out most blockers. Traverse Shadow, Grixis Shadow, and 3 and 4 color Death Shadow aggro decks all managed to find significant success throughout the remainder of 2017 and into 2018 without any other significant changes, but ultimately it would be Grixis Shadow that came out on top in terms of top 8s at major events. However, later versions of the deck made one key change. They put Temur Battle Rage back in, as you can see from Tyler Putnam's deck that won Grand Prix Portland in 2018. This made a lot of sense, since Gurmag Angler also comboed quite well with the powerful instant. Modern Death Shadow underwent its next significant change in 2019 when Rory Keir-Smith piloted a deck to victory at Grand Prix Birmingham. This version of the deck was an entirely new 3-color combination for Death Shadow. It was Mardu. The deck ran white largely to gain access to the recently printed Ranger Captain of Eos. The Ranger could tutor up your always important Death Shadow, and you could also use it in a similar fashion to Gitaxian Pro because you could sacrifice it to make sure that your opponent couldn't interact if you were planning on casting your Battle Rage on your Death Shadow. Some of the other benefits of going with white were access to Path to Exile, one of the most powerful removal spells in the format, and Tide Hollow Sculler, which gave you another card that could gain information about the opponent's hand while also taking a card away from it. Rory's deck didn't exactly become the standard build for the deck, as Grixis Death Shadow decks were still all over the place in 2019, but Mardu Death Shadow decks also found some decent success. However, Modern Death Shadow would undergo yet another major change in Modern in 2020. At last year's Magic Online Modern Championship, Comeback Kid top-8'd the event with a Death Shadow deck that featured some important new cards. This version of the deck was significantly more aggressive than any version of the deck had been in a while. It returned to running 1-drops other than Shadow, and most importantly, it added the recently printed 2-drop Scourge of the Skyclaves. The Scourge gave the deck another Death Shadow-like creature, as just like Death Shadow, it loves it when its controller pays life for stuff. It's a little different because it checks for other players' life totals too, but generally a Death Shadow deck keeps it and its opponent's life total low, so the Scourge tends to be pretty big, making it another great target for Battle Rage shenanigans. Despite only being a thing for about 5 years, Death Shadow decks have varied considerably over the time it's been a deck in Modern. It began as an aggro deck, but as we've seen, there were also plenty of control and mid-range versions of the deck in Modern too. Death Shadow has really only found success in one other format so far, Legacy. So let's take a look at what that deck has looked like over the years in that format. Legacy Death Shadow first emerged as a major force at Pro Tour 25th in 2018, where 2 of the top 8 decks were blue-black Death Shadow. Obviously, Legacy has a much larger card pool, so the decks are significantly different from what we've already seen. But the deck still plans on playing cheap early threats like Death Shadow and Gurmag Angler. However, in Legacy, Death Shadow is also frequently a running mate of Delver of Secrets, a creature that is heavily played in the format more broadly, and one that is effectively a 1-mana 3/2 with flying in a deck that has enough instants and sorceries. Legacy Death Shadow decks also have access to the powerful Snuff Out, a removal spell that you can pay 4 life for rather than the mana cost. Killing an opposing creature for no mana, while also growing your Death Shadow by +4/+4, is pretty devastating for your opponent. Obviously, of all the decks we've seen so far, Legacy Death Shadow goes the hardest into being a blue control deck, running a ton of counterspells and card draw. Blue-Black Death Shadow found significant success in Legacy throughout 2018 and 2019 without undergoing any significant changes. However, in 2020, we can see some significant changes have occurred. One of the first things you might notice from Katayama Ryuichi's deck is that it's no longer blue-black, but Sultai. It adds another 1-drop that can grow in a hurry in the form of Elvish Reclaimer. The deck runs a bunch of fetch lands, so it will be large quite often. In addition to that, it provides some important additional utility. It can search up any land, so you can find a wasteland if you need to destroy an opposing land, or you can grab a fetch land if you need to lose 3 more life for your Shadow. Running green also gave the deck access to the incredibly powerful Oko Thief of Crowns too, which doesn't have any super significant synergy with the deck. It's just a crazy powerful card that was effectively a staple in Legacy before it got banned there. Another great green card this deck has access to is Berserk, which pretty much fills the same role that Temur Battle Rage did in earlier versions of Death Shadow. You would cast it on a huge Death Shadow, give it trample, and it would kill your opponent. That's pretty much it though for Legacy Death Shadow. Death Shadow decks emerged pretty much out of nowhere in Modern in 2016, and since then the deck has had a very firm hold on the format, evolving with the times, but keeping the same game plan of paying a bunch of life and playing a huge Death Shadow. This is less true in Legacy, where the deck's success has been significantly more inconsistent, but it's still a pretty relevant deck there too. Additionally, Death's Shadow is also legal and historic as a result of being included in one of the recent historic anthologies on Magic Arena, and while it hasn't found premier level success so far, it is definitely a card to keep an eye on in the format going forward, especially as new cards continue to get added to the format's card pool. So that's the history of Death's Shadow decks. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the more than 10 other deck history videos I've already done, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you like hearing me talk about Magic history, consider also listening to me talk about medieval European history, which I do on my other channel, Need to Hone History. Thanks for watching.